When I was way back in seminary, half a century ago, I remember reading some biblical scholar who said we can know nothing about the personality or the inner human life of Jesus. And I thought, who told you this? And I got thinking about that a lot until one day I came to a story that is well known to all regular churchgoers from St. John's Gospel, the famous story of Jesus with the Samaritan woman at the well. And Jesus is thirsty and tired, and he sits down at this well. You can visit it in the Holy Land to this day. And a woman from the city, Sychar, comes out with her jug. The disciples go into the village to Sychar to get the Lord food, and for them too. And what ensues is this amazing conversation about water. Jesus engages the woman. He tells the woman things about her own life that amaze her, which induce her to run to the village and tell her fellow villagers, "Come meet a man who told me everything I ever did. Can this be the Messiah?" Meanwhile, just before she leaves, the disciples have come back from the village with food. And they are amazed that he's been talking to a woman on 2 scores. Jews don't have dealings with Samaritans, and she is a woman, and it turns out that she's been married 5 times, so maybe that's why she's out at the well alone. And here is Jesus engaged in this meaningful conversation with her about water and life and everything else. So they're amazed at that, and then they say, "Rabbi, eat." And he says to them, "I have food to eat that you don't know about." And they look at one another. Has anyone brought him lunch? They're wondering about the woman. And then he says something that answers my question from seminary. He says, "My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish his work, to accomplish his work." And I have been thinking about that for decades, about how revealing that is. In earlier Meanderings, I'd been saying that Jesus is simple, clear, and deep, whereas we are complicated, muddled, and shallow. Well, the depth of Jesus, the clarity of Jesus, and the simplicity of Jesus, if you pin those on what he says about "my food is to do the will of him who sent me," it takes you all the way back to the beginning of the faith of Judaism, where Moses says to the people that their trial in the wilderness was to teach them that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes out of the mouth of the Lord. And what Jesus is saying is that that's his food. And in fact, we believe that God, the Father, if you will, has the mind to create the universe, and he creates the universe through his word. Jesus not only feeds on that word, he is that word incarnate, and that is his inner life. And so we're going to talk about Holy Communion, the Eucharist, today. What happens in the Eucharist is that inner life of Jesus, that food, that will of the Father that constitutes his inner being, his personality, is what he communicates to us. Later on in St. John's Gospel, he'll say, "I am the bread which came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he shall live forever. And the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh." I mean, Jesus does not hold back. Then he goes further and he offends his hearers by saying, "For my flesh is food indeed, and my blood is drink indeed. He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood dwells in me, and I in him. As the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so she who eats me shall live because of me. What he's saying here is that his inner life radiates through his whole person, body, soul, and spirit, and that sacred, life-giving, death-defying humanity, which was nailed to the cross and raised on the third day, is ours by faith. Now, at the Last Supper, he actually uses these images to explain what's about to happen. At the Last Supper, he says, concerning the bread, he says, take and eat this. This is my body, which is given for you. After supper, he takes the cup. He said, drink from this, all of you. This is my blood, the blood of the new covenant, which is shed for you. He is interpreting his death not as a catastrophe or a tragedy, but as a life-giving event, if you will, a feeding of everyone who believes in him. And so what he said earlier about his flesh and his blood, about his inner life, his food, comes to bear on those of us who follow him and who believe in him. Now, when he offended his hearers, even some disciples turned away. Some of them said, this is a hard saying. Who can stand it? And then Jesus says, does this offend you? My words are spirit and my words are life. In other words, he's not talking about something carnal and, if you will, cannibalistic, which is what some of the offense was about. He said, my words are spirit and they are life. He is communicating to us that sacred humanity of his, that humanity that enjoys an unbroken relationship with God the Father, that humanity which is simple, clear, and deep, contrasted with mine or yours. Take, eat, drink this. This is my body. This is my blood. This is the core of the most familiar sacrament in the church, the one which at St. Peter's happens every single Sunday. Let me tell a story from 30 years ago. When the AIDS crisis broke out in the early 1980s, I was in Boston, and we had a remarkable parishioner who was infected with it, and he had had his ups and downs, and he was quite ill with it, and he insisted on receiving the chalice as well as the host. And you may remember that although there was a lot of superficial worry about people with AIDS communicating, the danger was to the person with the acquired immune deficiency syndrome, not for others. And so I spoke to him about this and said, let's say his name was John. John, why do you want to do this? Don't you think you put yourself a little bit at risk with the common cup? And he smiled. He said, no doubt. He said, but Father, I don't know how to put this, but I'll put it as bluntly as I can. He said, I need a transfusion of grace. And he had me. And he taught me a real fundamental lesson about Holy Communion. Now, another one concerning the virus is a story that probably a lot of people at St. Peter's know. Half the Episcopal Church may know it because it involves Bishop Michael Curry's father. And it's the reason why Bishop Curry is an Episcopalian. The story is, and I'm telling it roughly, is that his father and mother went to an Episcopal church. I think his father was a Baptist, maybe his mother was the Episcopalian. And his father may have been a minister as well. But his father was watching Holy Communion. It was the old 1928 prayer book, of course. It was the traditional liturgy. But what the father was interested in was communion, and what those almost all white communicants were going to do when his black wife went up to receive communion. He stayed back. Well, she went up, and what do you know? Not only the hosts were delivered, but then came round the chalice, and the person in front of her received the chalice. She received the chalice, and the people after her received the chalice, and she came back. That made an Episcopalian out of him. And that's why we have Bishop Curry. And that's why now, under the virus, I grieve when I celebrate the Eucharist, as I will, again, at St. Peter's sometime. Take this, drink from this. This is my blood, and I know that out of charity we can't yet. And I realize what a powerful communion symbol the common cup has been for millennia. And right now we can't have it. That's happened before in Christian history, but it's a new experience for me. And it's sharp. The words for the administration of Holy Communion were much fuller in the 1928 prayer book. They're preserved in Rite 1, in some forms in Rite 1 in the current prayer book. But the virus really sharpens this, and it's a great teaching device. When you receive the host and then the chalice, it's not just the body of Christ, the bread of heaven, the blood of Christ, the cup of salvation. It's here we go, and this is where the rubber hits the road with the virus. The body of our Lord Jesus Christ, which was given for thee, singular, for thee, preserve thy body and soul unto everlasting life. Here we go. Take and eat this in remembrance that Christ died for thee. Further, and feed on him in thy heart by faith with thanksgiving. Go right back to St. John's Gospel. My words are spirit and my words are life. Does this offend you? My words are spirit and my words are life. And of course, we also have that great prayer called the Prayer of Humble Access. It's fantastic. It is available in modern language, but it's only in the Church of England New Rites. But we do not presume to come to this, your table, merciful Lord, trusting in our own righteousness, God forbid. But in your manifold and great mercies, we are not worthy so much as to gather up the crumbs under your table, but you are the same Lord whose property is always to have mercy. Grant us, therefore, gracious Lord, so to eat the flesh of your dear Son, Jesus Christ, and to drink his blood. Now here we go. That our sinful bodies may be made clean by his body, and our souls washed through his most precious blood, and that we may evermore dwell in him and he in us. There you go. That's the communication of that simple, clear, and deep Jesus, his sacred humanity, to Andrew's complicated, muddled, and shallow life. Or to quote my friend back in Boston, I need a transfusion. He did, so do I. And that's what's involved in the heart of Holy Communion, and thank God for it. I mean, no matter what else happens in church, it seems to me that's why I'm there. That's why I'm there. I mean, the circumstances under which the Mass has been celebrated, when you think about it, at a marriage, at a funeral, before a war, during a war, after one, for peace, for justice, that my beloved spouse will recover from this illness, that we might have a baby, that our child might be saved from illness, for my first Holy Communion, for my last rites, for fair weather, for some rain, please. How many different circumstances are there? At the coronation of a monarch, at the execution of a criminal. It's been done in all of these places, and will be. The Eucharist is the sine qua non, the not without which of the church. It is the heartbeat of the church. Everything else in the church, it seems to me, is organized around it. Walk into St. Peter's and see what you see. What do you see? It's organized around the Eucharist. The chickens say so too. Is where it's at. I have a story from when I was alienated from the church. I didn't want to go to church. My parents were concerned about it. I wasn't even an Episcopalian. We were members of the liberal Protestant Disciples of Christ Church. And the one thing that distinguished them was they had communion every Sunday, celebrated by the lay people. They were a little more free and easy about it. It was one of the things actually that brought me into the Episcopal Church, when I realized that our Eucharist is tapped into how they did it in the beginning. But nevertheless, this minister came to visit me. He said, "Andrew, I understand you haven't been coming around or wanted to come around to church." I said, "No, I was really on my way out in more ways than I realized. I can worship God anywhere." He said, "I'm sure you're right. I'm sure you're right." He said, "You can't get communion just anywhere, though, can you?" And he had me with that. Checkmate. I didn't quite admit it, but I knew it the minute he said that. He was ever so good. And I remember when I was a brand new priest, I was in Oxford, England, and for some weird reason, I was going through all these doubts about the creed. And I was going through these doubts while I was standing at the altar in my vestments celebrating the Eucharist. And all of a sudden, I looked at what I was doing, and it was as though I was getting rebuked right from the bread and the wine there on the altar, as though the Lord right there was saying, "Andrew, what are you doing here?"
Talk more about that.
I thought, what am I doing here? I thought, actions speak louder than words. And it was like a slap in the face. And it brought me around back to, away from mental quibbling. I was all tied up in knots about something in a classroom. And there's the Eucharist, our lifeline. Behind me were several old ladies in this lovely old parish in Oxford who were there early in the morning, and that was part of the rebuke. I thought, and what are they doing here? They're better than I am. I'm a whippersnapper and a wise guy.
How would you explain this? I mean, you already have in some ways, but to someone who is completely unfamiliar with it, like, talk about it in last week when you were kind of prepping me or whatever, talking about the idea of a meal, and like, what do we think about a meal? You know.
Well, let's just start there. Let's start there. Jesus is giving us a meal. Bread and wine. What's that all about? Why did he do that? What does that symbolize? Well, let's before we drive all the way in, let's just begin with that. You're part of the fellowship. Here are the members of the body. When I was a kid at the Disciples of Christ Church, we had a lady who sat not far from us. She was very devout. And in the Disciples Church, they'd send the tokens in the little glasses through them. Pew. I would have mine, and I would look at her, and because I admired her. I mean, she was very reverent, pray. And then I would look what I had, and I mean, it's as if, are you in there? You know what? You start where you are. And that's not a bad place to begin. What does it mean? How does communion connect us? Well, I used to think, starting with my own family, there were Dad and Mom and my sister and other people, and we were receiving communion, and I thought, okay, we're in touch with Jesus. Jesus is in touch with us, and therefore we're in touch with each other in a better way. It's not just my sister Gail who irritates me, or I irritate her. It's not just, we're in communion with each other in a better way. We're not just Andy and Gail and Mom and Dad and whoever are down the altar rail. We are members of Jesus. And Jesus occupies life and space and time through our following him in those places. I take it that's what the body of Christ means, is that we live and enact and embody Christ where we go. And to the degree we're more surrendered to him, to that degree we're more effective in representing him. I mean, I look at effective people. I look at my maternal grandmother, who to me still represents unconditional love. And she, to me, whether she knew it or not, brought me closer to what I believe about Jesus. And, you know, she wasn't a very verbal Christian. Well, you wouldn't know that. She wasn't a very verbal Christian. She thought the Lord was lovely. She went to church if somebody took her. She was just a self-sacrificial darling. And to me, she embodied what I believe has to do with a lot of who Jesus Christ is. She wasn't the Lord, but she was simple and pretty clear, and I think deep because she loved and suffered for her love so well. She was not full of herself. Isn't that an interesting paradox? The more full you are of yourself, the more complicated, muddled, and shallow you are. When you're not full of yourself, there's room for a lot more. Well, let's wrap it up. Let's go back to the beginning, or near the beginning. The Eucharist is for all baptized Christians. Wherever you are on the spiritual spectrum, it's for you. You don't have to have the wisdom of Thomas Aquinas and the holiness of Francis of Assisi to begin to receive it. Jesus will bring you further in, both mentally and spiritually. Just let him do it. Be open to him. And that child who just begins with knowing the difference between a holy meal and a regular meal, we're on the way right there. There we go.